The summer of 1945 was heavy with both relief and uncertainty. In Europe, Germany had surrendered. Scores of young German women who had served in auxiliary roles, communications, administration, Air Force support, and more, found themselves rounded up as prisoners of war by Allied forces. Many had known privation, scarcity, and the constant stress of bombardment. Their world had grown smaller, their daily routine shaped by rationing, fear, and the demands of war. They were shipped across the Atlantic to the United States. For many, this voyage itself was terrifying. Steerage holds, crowded quarters, rough seas, echoes of what they had lost, homes, families, the land they could no longer call their own. Yet there was also a strange relief that the war was over, that their fate would now depend on something other than frontline chaos. When they arrived at the POW camps in America, some of which had housed male German soldiers earlier, they were processed, given medical exams, and assigned quarters. They expected the worst: harsh treatment, cold neglect, punishment. They had heard stories of brutality on all sides. Some of them whispered among themselves, "We are the enemy now." They braced for humiliation. Yet one of the first orders given to them seemed almost incongruous. They were instructed to bathe, not in cold water pumped from buckets, not in perfunctory scrubbing with coarse cloths or lye, but in showers with running hot water and soap. Simple white bars of soap, clean towels, and a promise of privacy and dignity. For these women, many of whom had not seen such hygiene in months or even years, the notion was startling. On that first morning, they were led to communal shower rooms. The guards, American soldiers, stood aside, waiting respectfully. The women hesitated at the threshold. Some froze. Others looked at the bars of soap in their hands, as though they were talismans. They looked at the warm steam rising, the running water, the clean tile floors. For many, the idea of bathing as a civilized routine, instead of clipped wartime necessity, was almost alien. One woman closed her eyes and ran the soap across her arm. She felt the lather, felt the smoothness, and tears stung her eyes. She had forgotten what it was like to have cleanliness as a right rather than a battle. Around her, others were already beginning. Faces slack, voices muted, the silence broken only by the gurgle of drains and water. Some of them lingered under the water, letting it flow over them. They held the soap, gazed at the foam in their palm, as though wondering, why do they treat us like this? They associated enemy status with cruelty, but here they encountered tenderness. In the days following that first shower, small reverberations spread through the camp. The women talked among themselves in hushed voices. Some joked awkwardly, so this is how Americans do bathrooms. Others gathered in corners, pressing damp hands to their faces, stroking their hair, marveling at softness or smooth skin. Their correspondents and whispers to sympathetic guards described it: hot water, towels, no barking orders, no humiliation, just dignity. This was in stark contrast to what many had endured in Germany during the final years of the war. Fuel shortages, austerity, damaged water systems, destroyed infrastructure, long lines for any basic necessity. The camp authorities had a logic. They believed that POWs treated humanely were less likely to rebel or despair. The Geneva Conventions required decent treatment. But beyond that, there was something moral, almost a demonstration to the women themselves, that surrender did not mean dehumanization, that even an enemy had a right to basic human dignity. In the mess halls, in the quarters, talk turned to more than hygiene. They compared food rations now to what they had in Germany. Here the bread was fresh, the vegetables varied. The hospital facilities were better than many had seen at home. Some women who had medical training in Germany were drafted, reluctantly, to help camp medical staff. They felt a mix of guilt, relief, and disorientation. Yet not all responses were immediate relief. Some women were suspicious. They paused in front of mirrors, looking at their faces, gaunt, tired, drawn. Could this be real? Others felt shame. How long had I let myself decay? The shock of kindness mingled with shame over one's neglected body. A few refused initially to shower or to change into clean clothes, holding on to ragged garments. They feared mockery or that they were being set up. Slowly, With gentle encouragement from caretaking staff, they submitted. And each time, the ritual seemed to break down emotional walls. The water washed away grime. The soap washed away the sense of being spoiled. The act of washing became also a psychological balm. There were quiet moments, too. A woman standing at a sink, her reflection softened in the steam, eyes red. Another running her hands through her hair, as though rediscovering a self she had lost. Children had none, but the emotional child in each of them was comforted. The prisoners began to feel that this place, though foreign, offered more than a cage. They found small dignity. Months passed. The camp schedule settled into rhythms. Roll call, work details, meals, rest periods. The bath/shower routines remained a sacred part of those rhythms. Each woman knew her turn, its privacy, its relief. Guards and staff maintained discipline, but also tried to be humane, offering toiletries, reading materials, fresh linens. Among the prisoners, quiet transformations occurred. Some began writing letters home, in German, praising the basic decency they found, though tempered by guilt or fear that such words might seem traitorous. A few wrote that America was strange, the highways, the fields, the towns, green beyond memory. The showers, they mentioned them, almost shyly, as though that singular detail must be handled delicately. One older woman, who had been in charge of equipment in the Luftwaffe Auxiliary, confided in a younger one, "I almost cried when I first held that soap. I thought this is too much, too grand for me." The younger nodded, tears in her eyes. "I had forgotten what was to breathe freely." In the infirmary wing, some women who arrived ill, exhausted, or badly malnourished were stabilized. The clean water, the soft towels, the sanitary living conditions all contributed. The guards and doctors sometimes asked them how life had been at home, what they missed the most. Many said, water, running hot water, baths. It was both banal and profound. Outside local American communities sometimes visited the camps on arranged tours. Some guards invited German POWs to speak modestly at church groups, athletic meets, or civic gatherings. The visitors were sometimes startled. These were German women, not hardened soldiers, but young, frightened, curious. When asked how they were treated, many would, hesitantly, speak of their showers and soap. Some American guests were taken aback. "You mean they gave you soap?" The women nodded. Yes, they did. By mid-1946, as repatriation gradually began, many of those women left America with indelible memories. Some carried bars of American soap home. Others kept small towels or washcloths. Some said they would never look at bathing the same way again. Yet, of course, the departure was bittersweet. Once back in Europe, conditions often reverted to scarcity and struggle. Some women compared even the worst German winter to that brief period in America when they had clean, warm water, privacy, and a sense of humanity revived. Years later, when the noise of war had long faded into memory and the former camps had been reclaimed by grass and silence, the story of the German women prisoners in America seemed almost forgotten. Yet among historians and in the quiet recollections of the women themselves, one detail kept resurfacing, a small, almost ordinary act that carried extraordinary meaning. The day they were given soap and told to shower. At first glance it might seem trivial, a routine of hygiene. But for those women, that first shower had become a symbol of confusion, disbelief, and the slow rediscovery of humanity after years of moral and physical deprivation. They had come from bomb-shattered cities where water was scarce. Soap was a luxury, and fear hung in the air like dust. In Germany's final months, cleanliness had been replaced by survival. Baths were for the privileged or for soldiers with rank. Civilians and auxiliaries lived in shelters, cellars, and half-destroyed dormitories, where every day carried the smell of smoke and rationed bread. Then, in a single moment, the world had reversed. Captivity in America, an enemy land across an ocean, brought them not cruelty but care, not vengeance but discipline mingled with respect. Decades later, many would admit that it was one of the most disorienting moments of their lives. To be treated kindly by those they had been told were monsters. How could that be true? Some of the former prisoners, interviewed in the 1970s and 1980s, recalled the strange mixture of fear and gratitude that settled over the camp. One woman, who had been barely 20 when she arrived, said in a trembling voice, "We expected hate. We thought the Americans would punish us. Instead, they gave us soap, real soap. I cried because I did not understand." For the American guards and Red Cross officials, these gestures were policy. The Geneva Conventions required that all prisoners of war be treated humanely, with adequate food, medical care, and sanitation. But for the women who had lived through scarcity, every bar of soap felt like an impossible luxury. The guards who distributed them could not have known the emotional power they carried, the memories of dirt, fear, and shame they would wash away. Life in the camps followed strict schedules. There were fences, roll calls, curfews. But within those limits, daily existence was far from the brutality they had feared. Many of the women were given work in camp hospitals or kitchens. Some learned English from the guards. Others picked up American songs heard over loudspeakers or radio broadcasts. They formed small choirs, knitting circles, and makeshift classrooms. For the first time in years, they could read without censorship, write letters without propaganda slogans, speak their minds in whispers that grew braver with each passing week. Still, they never forgot that first encounter with American soap. It became a private metaphor between them. "Do you remember the shower?" one would ask decades later, and the others would smile, half embarrassed, half wistful. They would remember standing beneath the spray, unsure whether to laugh or cry, their bodies steaming the warmth, the sound of water echoing like a hymn of peace. For some, the memory was bittersweet. It brought back the guilt of survival. They had been enemies of the state that had unleashed unimaginable destruction, and yet they were treated better in captivity than many civilians at home. One woman later wrote in her diary, "It was the first time I felt shame, not because of defeat, but because of kindness." That shame would follow her for years. She spent her life trying to understand it. Why a simple act of compassion could weigh heavier than any punishment. When the repatriation process began, between 1946 and 1947, the camps gradually emptied. The women boarded ships back to a Germany that no longer looked like home. Cities lay in ruins, streets were blackened, and food was rationed more strictly than during wartime. The returnees were greeted not as heroes, but as ghosts, reminders of a lost war. They carried few belongings, perhaps a small photograph, a book, or a folded towel. Some had smuggled tiny slivers of American soap, wrapped in cloth, as keepsakes. To them it was not just soap, but a relic, a symbol of the moment when the world had briefly shown mercy. In post-war Germany, as Reconstruction began, stories of life in American POW camps spread quietly. Most civilians found them hard to believe. How could the enemy have treated German prisoners with such decency? There were murmurs of jealousy, disbelief, sometimes resentment. But the women knew what they had lived through. The showers, the food, the medical care. These had restored something deeper than the body. They had been reminders that identity, even in defeat, did not erase humanity. Over the decades, these recollections entered historical archives, letters, and oral histories. Historians studying the treatment of Axis POWs in the United States began to notice a pattern. Many of them described humane conditions, educational opportunities, and an emphasis on moral re-education rather than revenge. The women's testimonies, though fewer in number than men's, added a gender dimension, how dignity and hygiene could become instruments of psychological restoration. Some survivors returned to America years later, as tourists or immigrants. They visited the towns near their former camps, searching for the places that had changed them. In interviews, they spoke not of barbed wire or guard towers, but of soap, towels, and water. One said softly, "In those showers, I learned that not all enemies are evil. That was the beginning of my new life." Another wrote to a former camp nurse, thanking her for treating us as women, not as prisoners. Modern historians view that story as more than anecdote. It represents a turning point in the understanding of victory. The Americans, for all their flaws, realized that moral authority came not from domination, but from restraint. By treating their captives with decency, they not only upheld international law, but also modeled a vision of post-war order, one in which human rights would matter, even in defeat. The soap and showers became symbols of a new kind of warfare, one that sought to win hearts as much as territories. Psychologists studying trauma have found that such experiences can be transformative. For people who have lived under totalitarian regimes or constant fear, acts of kindness can produce profound cognitive dissonance. The German women, conditioned by years of Nazi propaganda, had been taught that the Allies were barbaric. When they met compassion instead, the entire moral structure of their upbringing cracked. Some began questioning everything they had believed. That inner revolution, quiet, private, but enduring, was part of the larger denazification that unfolded after the war. Yet even kindness carries contradictions. The same America that offered soap and hot water to POWs also struggled with segregation, with racial injustice, with its own moral inconsistencies. In that sense, the story of the showers is not about perfection, but about possibility. The possibility of decency even amid hypocrisy. It reveals how small gestures can ripple across generations, shaping how enemies remember each other. Archival letters from camp officers show that the American command viewed humane treatment as pragmatic. They reasoned that today's prisoners might be tomorrow's allies in rebuilding Europe. Treat them well, they argued, and they will carry home a better image of democracy. Whether or not the women fully understood this policy, they felt its effects. Many later became teachers, nurses, or civic volunteers in post-war Germany. When asked why, they often said the same thing, because they had once been treated kindly when they least deserved it. In documentary form, this final chapter closes not with battlefields or political speeches, but with a simple image, a row of women standing quietly under falling water. Steam fills the air. Their faces, pale and thin, begin to soften. The camera lingers on the bar of soap in one woman's hands, a symbol of something far larger than hygiene. She rubs it between her palms, looks up and smiles faintly, as if realizing for the first time that survival can also mean forgiveness. The narrator's voice fades over archival photographs and soft music. History remembers wars to their battles, their treaties, and their losses. But sometimes, it is the smallest act that defines our humanity. A bar of soap, a warm shower, and the courage to treat even the enemy with respect. In that moment, far from home, a few frightened women learned that mercy could cleanse more than the body. It could cleanse the soul. And as the credits roll, the viewer is left with the understanding that this forgotten story of German women prisoners in America is not merely a historical curiosity. It is a reminder, still urgent today, that compassion, even in victory, remains one of the most radical acts a nation can perform.